Hello, I want to welcome everyone to the Power of Our Story. We are a group of safety for our protectors to come process their journey with others that get it. We don't want you to suffer in silence. There are wonderful people in this group. And so if you are a protector, you are welcome anytime to just be able to connect to people or maybe even to pay it forward. Maybe you just want to be there for somebody else. So today we have our wonderful group here, the 11 a.m. call. I'm filling in for Patrick and Chris Gregorio. And so I do have a topic that I would love to talk about. It's always kind of in the back of my mind. And that is the topic of vulnerability. And, I think one thing that I learned as a civilian, as I got to know more veterans the last 8 years and then first responders, is, we talk about that. We talk about that word. So vulnerability, capable of being physically or emotionally wounded. And when I, talk to SEALs about, their time in combat, they're trained, and I believe it's from, other protectors too. They just have articulated this, that they are trained to suffer in silence because that's what helps the mission go forward. And vulnerability means that they are looking to exploit the enemy's vulnerabilities, and they are armoring up to protect themselves from vulnerability. So that can get them killed. So vulnerability is not a word that they're going to, put them, it's not something that is second nature. And I just want to talk about that because the sad thing is when they get back to reconnecting with the heart and living in civilian life and really living life, that's where we're losing a lot of our protectors to suicide because they're suffering in silence and they don't really understand that vulnerability is the new courage. It's the new mission in life. It's the way that we deeply connect with our loved ones. And so today I just want to open this up to our protectors on this group. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on vulnerability, and on the inside, what makes you feel safe emotionally? What has helped you maybe in a very vulnerable time? How did people react to you or treat you that made you feel safe to take that step to be vulnerable and connect? So I'm just going to stick with that. I'd like to open it up. Michelle, do you want to go ahead and share? We'll go back to Paul.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just want to say, like, vulnerability for me was not something like that I had a problem with until I got into dispatch. At 19 years old, I became a dispatcher, and I was very vulnerable, I would say, within my first year of work. And if a call affected me, I mean, I would talk about it. And it was almost like everybody was like, okay, yeah, get a hold of yourself and move on. You have another call to answer. So it was almost ingrained within me to tuck that vulnerability away. And so when you do that, and then for me, it ended up being 13 years later, it was compiling inside of me so bad that it finally took my coworker coming up to me and saying, I recognize a lot of me and you need to go get help right now. And that means taking a break from work. I didn't know that that break would have lasted over a year, and it meant me leaving my career field. But it took someone coming to me and saying, you're not fooling me. I can tell something's wrong. I can tell you're in deep. And so knowing that it wasn't even just being called out of my own actions and thinking I was a better actress than I actually was, but it was the fact that she told me, like, I've been there. I know what you went through. I know what you're feeling right now. You have to get help. And I think from that point on, that's what slowly started breaking down those walls to teach me how to be vulnerable again. And it's still not easy. It's defaulted within me to revert back to not being vulnerable. But I have to, it is a constant fight every day. Every sentence that I say, I have to be aware of, am I stuffing things away or am I allowing myself to be vulnerable because I don't know who I could potentially help the way that my coworker helped me and probably honestly saved my life. She definitely saved my relationship with my now fiance and saved my mothering to my 3-year-old at the time.
Oh, Michelle, that is gold right there. So what I heard you say that the safety, what your coworker did was basically say, hey, listen, I've been there. And that created the safety to at least follow through
Yeah.
with what she said.
And it was genuine. There was no, I knew her backstory. I knew what she was referring to. And she definitely had been there. It wasn't like a, I've taken a bad call before. I know you must be struggling. Like there was a real, she was being vulnerable with me. And that comes across in the genuine nature of what she was saying.
That's awesome. And that's what we want to highlight here. Like as, or protectors, caring bridge builders, is this is the way that we can help other people, is just like how your coworker helped you. The power of her own story helped you to move forward and maybe saved a lot of things in your life, possibly your life. And that's what we want to do to other protectors. So beautifully shared. Thank you so much. And Janet.
Yeah, I'm struggling with this one a little bit for vulnerability. As I think back, um, I didn't even realize about vulnerability. Um, when we take our calls and stuff, we're vulnerable to those calls. Um, I got in not as a young career, but after I had kids in school and stuff, but also have been a spouse, and spouses are vulnerable. Like I and I've shared before, like we have to be careful. Our husbands at the time, like we're going back many, many years in the 70s, they were trained not to even mention anything. You heard everything. And for a little bit of background, with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and we're more a federal police force with contracts, so we move around. We're not always in the same town, city, or province, and so we're vulnerable every time we move. Like we don't know who our neighbors are, we don't know the other members, and the spouses. At the time, we were more critical. I found that we were judgmental as spouses, and because we had to band together. Like none of us were from that town, from that village, or wherever we lived. We were each on other's own country, but we didn't have any structure either. And then when I got into the force and started working, didn't even understand about the calls, and that we weren't trained that this was going to happen to us or what was going to happen. So having children taking a call about from a child or an injury of the child or something like that, I was open to, like, vulnerable. It's like, a sponge to taking that, but then finding out that it's traumatic to you. You don't even realize it. And it didn't even occur to me until after I went through with the psychologist, then being vulnerable as in describing as talking about things and sharing things. I talked about everything that I shared with everybody, because it was like, in not doing it, and especially at work, like Michelle will say, you buckle up, like this is your job and you do your job. You push everything down to be able to do that job and take that call and deal with that call. But when that cracks, you're vulnerable. You are like, it's like an open wound. It's like there's nothing you can control until you can revisit that or restructure yourself. And like I said, 2003 was my diagnosis. I didn't find you guys till almost 3 years later, right? Or 3 years ago. I'm going into my third year with you guys. And I cannot be more grateful to this group for that, to be really open. And I am pretty much open book. I've talked about it, I've written about it, but it's like, even my friends, they don't get me like you guys do. That I can talk about it and be who I am in this group, that I can't be out necessarily in general public. Although I am more so that all the time. Like I share the stories all the time. because we never know what someone else is hiding. And that, to me, is vulnerability.
Thank you, Janet. You're a powerful presence on this group, all these years. And I just want to make sure too, did I understand you right? There was a camaraderie earlier with the other moms, but there wasn't vulnerability. Like there would be judgment maybe in it. So you couldn't be.
Well, what I found is more gossip, right? Talking
Yeah.
about, like, they were on watches, our guys were on watches. So it's the other watch and the other, it was clicky,
Yeah.
like coming in as a new spouse. And, I was very grateful to one of the spouses early on in Les's career to say, you know what? Your husband's not around all the time. You can do your housework when he's not there. And, just be with him, like do things. And she was much older and wiser at the time. And they'd gone through traumatic stuff in his career. And so there was wisdom in that, but there wasn't always wisdom. There was lots of real clicky. And that's the sad part.
Yeah.
And you say that you are the 5 people you surround yourself with. And I'm very grateful to when I fell into my job and worked with a most amazing woman who was also a spouse and left all that other world behind me. And, I'm not perfect, like I say, but that was the journey.
Thank you for sharing that. I think, I think that just goes across the board. I mean, people gossip because it is a way to connect, but it is a clear sign that, I can't be vulnerable here. So it's a real double-edged sword. It does not protect you. So that's a very unsafe way of connecting because people are not being vulnerable. So they'd rather, talk about somebody else. It's not healing. It's not connecting. And I appreciate you sharing that because I get the feeling too, when sometimes people talk about their agencies or what it's like to be in the military, there's a strong connection, but is there a place where you feel like you can be really vulnerable with no judgment to heal? And that's what we really want to bring out in this conversation. Like, how can we get into that gap where we're losing people or the mental health is going down because they can't find a community to heal in without judgment. I know it's getting talked about more now, which is encouraging. Jim, what's on your mind? Thank you, Janet.
So it's interesting when Janet made the comment about being a child taking those calls, and because I actually was, because I started as a dispatcher when I was 16, and taking those calls and processing them and that type of thing, and really, never thought much of it until a lot later in my life, obviously. But I grew up in my parents were a little bit older. I was the youngest of 5, so I was we had a good family dynamic or whatever, but there wasn't a lot of like family vulnerability type of thing, right, in the way that I was raised. And so I think that kind of transpired into who I was, moving into my career. But then when I went to work in the fire department, I worked with and for a lot of people who were Vietnam veterans, who were suppressing everything that they had dealt with. And that was the culture, right? That was they didn't talk about that stuff. They weren't going to talk about this stuff that we were dealing with in our jobs either, right? And so it really, it drove that, and then 10 years later, when I had my own kids, I saw the same, I was that same parent, right? That sort of not vulnerable with my kids or, that type of thing, until much later in life. But I think it was all geared around, my dad was a World War II type person, right? So I think some of that, everybody that I was around was suppressing things from their past, and or what was going on currently and not talking about it. So we never created that environment. And for me, I had this, I always talk, and people would don't hug me, don't get in my space. I'm not that type of person. I used to do a thing with my hand in front of my face, like, hey, get out of my area, I'm going to put up the walls and, all that kind of stuff. And it wasn't until I became a senior leader in the organizations and had ultimate responsibility for a bunch of people, and saw some of the impacts of the behavioral wellness stuff, that I became a very strong proponent for it. And even then I wasn't, vulnerable per se about sharing my story, but I knew that what I had been through and, that kind of thing, that I needed to do stuff to try to prevent that. And eventually that allowed me to start to tell people why I was passionate about it. Well, let me take you back, 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And then the cancer was sort of the same, type of thing. But it was where I started to, really open up and become vulnerable was when I ended up in an organization where I was put on the spot to tell my story, to talk about my journey and to sit back and, look at pictures from throughout my life and my career to like put that together, those momentous moments in life where, it's like, okay, that was significant and why. And so, and I do my storytelling using those pictures, right, on my PowerPoint to kind of remind myself of like, all right, this is what goes with that and ties in. But it was through that that created that ability to be vulnerable. But I also can look back and see the environments that I grew up in or worked in, or however you want to put it, where that was, suppressing the vulnerability was the key element of survival at that point. I mean, that was just how it was portrayed.
Wow. Thanks, Jim. Well, you know this, you're definitely not alone in that, but what's so great is that you have seen that and you have a great story to tell about learning how to be vulnerable. And it sounds like you're definitely breaking a family cycle and you're teaching your kids just through your connection with them and sharing your story and being vulnerable. That's exciting. And that's, I think, what needs to be displayed. That's what needs to be modeled. And I appreciate you doing that. Thank you. Scott.
Hey, Jim, real quick, thanks for those tickets. You know what I'm talking about. They were incredible tickets that my friends got to enjoy, but thanks for reaching out with that. You're a good man.
I'm just glad somebody got to use them.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, they were too. So, I think Jim hit on something that is very similar in the military, specifically in the Marine Corps, and even Sara, as you talked about with Navy SEALs. That is a meat-eating environment. It's absolutely alpha male. It's every day. It's 24/7. That's just the way it is. And people who don't understand vulnerability can misunderstand what it's all about and see it as absolutely a sign of weakness, because they don't process it the same way. And another point that Jim mentioned, like say with him, and I think it's probably something that a lot of folks can relate to, is you don't necessarily get to maybe understanding it and then experience it until you're older, until you have gone through, life a bit and have perspective to be able to see things a little differently. In the moment, it's right here. But as you put time and distance between events and you start to look at things, and it's like, oh, wow, I didn't handle that maybe the way I should have. I should have been open to listening to, what this person had to say instead of, so things like that. I think your time in the saddle helps you become vulnerable, right? That's, that's one way. There's other things. But for me, as a Marine, I was blessed because I had really good leaders. Not all of them were vulnerable, but some were. And I didn't necessarily understand it as being that at the time. But over time, looking back on it, that's exactly what it was. People that were willing to listen, who did say, hey, why don't you swing by my office? I want to chat. Hey, roger that. And then it's, hey, everything okay? Oh, yes, sir. Well, I just wanted to check in on you and make sure that things were going. You know, you've been very busy and you don't seem like yourself. And I just wanted to see if things were good. And it's like, oh, wow, this guy actually cares, right? He was opening himself up to, criticism too, because that's just not the way it was. Now, I think it's changed a bit, and and that's a good thing, as far as the military goes. But yeah, my last job, I was a battalion commander, and I made it a point to let folks know that that's okay. Absolutely, we have a mission. The people are the ones who make mission, so you can't have mission without people and the dynamics of who we are, right? Everyone's wearing the same uniform. We're one team, but we come from different parts and different walks of life. We're people. We're not robots. The name tape that says Marine, well, that's not all of who you are. Yes, you're a Marine, but you're a person and you have struggles, and that's okay. If there are things going on, we'll help. Why wouldn't we? If you sprain your ankle, I wouldn't tell you to suck it up. Maybe it depends on where we are at the moment, but I would make sure that that person got help, that they went and, saw the corpsman, saw the doctor, got into a rehab program, whatever it took to get them well. That's what you do, and so opening yourself up to people in that regard shows them that maybe, okay, I can trust that person because they have my best interest at heart. And so they're sharing there, that folks know that. But you have to live that, right? You have, more than just saying it, you have to follow through with that part of being vulnerable with other people. And I'll just say this last thing. Yeah, men can be vulnerable, and it doesn't mean that you're a crybaby. Doesn't mean that you're weak. I'll be watching a.
You muted yourself.
Oh, there you go. We want to hear you, Scott. You're muted. Oh, it's a call. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I'm telling you guys, it's always the cliffhanger, right? When something happens, it's like, yeah, it's okay, Scott. I have to say, I just want my son to serve under a leader like Scott. Go ahead, Scott.
Oh, okay. Well, I couldn't hear anything until you saying going ahead. I'm on my cell phone. A call came in. I dismissed it, and it disturbs your ability to talk until the call goes away. But yeah, what I was going to say is, I mean, even now, and this happened years ago. I'm sitting there watching a commercial on TV, and it was very, very touching. And I just this stuff starts coming out of my eyeballs. It's wet down my cheeks, and I was like, what the heck is this? That's crazy. And, but it's okay. It was touching. And that was my response. If someone's going to challenge me on that, hey, let's talk about it. Let's have a discussion. All right. So wrapping it all up here for me, and this is something that I didn't know until I read it. I love history, and I was reading a book on George Washington called His Excellency. Fantastic book. If you love history, if you like George Washington, that's one you got to read. But there's a part, and it's towards the end of the war, right? The War for Independence, where he finds out that there's a plot to go and rebel against the Congress because they hadn't been paid. So a couple of officers got together and said, hey, on this day, we're going to go march on Washington and demand our pay. So, or excuse me, on Philadelphia and demand our pay. And so George Washington finds out about this, and he calls a meeting on the day that they're supposed to go do this. So they were like, okay, geez, I guess if we're not there for the meeting, they're going to know something's up. So they come to this meeting, it's all hands, everyone's there. And George Washington has his couple guys amongst the audience watching to see, what the reaction will be. when they listen to what he says. And he's talking to them about, we have put so much into these last few years. We're almost at the finish line. We are almost there. Don't let something get into your mind and into your heart that's going to turn around all of our sacrifice. And he said, I have a letter here I want to read. And he reached in and he pulled out his glasses. You know, these were kind of new things for him. And he had tears in his eyes. And he said, I too have grown old in the service of my country. And he put the glasses on and he read the letter, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. That's vulnerability, you know, being able to have that emotion and still, you know, get your point across, let folks know. If George Washington can have a few tears, not theatrical, but real tears, the impact that that had on that group, all the thoughts of going to get their pay dissolved because he put it right back into their heart and mind about, you know, we need to get this done, right? And so I always say, if George Washington can cry, I think we're in good company. You know, if he showed his vulnerability to those men because it mattered, he could have chewed their ass, right? He could have got up and done this, and that probably wouldn't have worked. But I think God was also involved, right? And put it on his heart, and that emotion came out. And that was the best possible outcome, how that was handled, because they didn't march, and we're sitting here today talking about vulnerability, right?
Wow.
And, you know, so anyhow, God
Well,
bless America. It's the 4th of July weekend.
yeah, gosh, that was beautifully shared, Scott. I bet we're all a little bit teary. That's powerful. Thank you. And I just want to say too, I just, even from the beginning part of what you said, the safety, it was the gift of the leader. It's the gift of you, of caring and listening for your people or for somebody else that may be struggling, and just how powerful that is, and just a different trajectory that puts people on when somebody cares like that, to give them the safety and the space to be vulnerable, especially I think with our protectors, because you're trained many times in you know, for war. So thank you. That was beautiful, Scott. I appreciate that. Papa Ron.
Yeah, in these conversations, there are things that are, I don't want to say triggering, but definitely thought-provoking. Scott, you mentioned toward the end of the war, the most vulnerable we are in actuality is the entry and exit of practically any operation or event or response. Anticipation, excitement going in, all those things, not knowing, coming back, letting our guard down, thinking it's all going to be wonderful, and then get hit in the face with, you know, the plumbing's gone. All our money's gone because we had to fix something, or the car's broken, and all that stuff just hits you in the face coming back. There's, in the Spanish language, okay, so I've learned what helps me be safe is when people give me cues that it is safe, like you mentioned there. In the Spanish language, there's the phrases tú and usted. Tú is very familiar, you know, and usted is much more formal. In the Spanish language, the one with the authority gives kind of this nuance. It's okay to call me, rather than abuelito, you know, or abuelo or abuelo, which is grandma and grandpa. The grandma and the grandpa give the children kind of this cue that it's okay to call me abuelito or abuelita, which is grandma and grandpa. It's a more endearing term, getting closer. And the Spanish language is good about that because the person with that differential, like you said, kind of gave you the authority to come up and be more familiar. And I think as veterans and first responders, when we go into units, we become very familiar very fast, and we don't have time we have to come in with our skills, our what we do, and just be upfront with it and not vulnerable at all about our environment. And then, but after I got out, I would become familiar much more quickly with people than they could stand, and talking about how it is. And what I found is that I had a lesson about the levels of friendship. Not everybody's an enemy, but not everybody is the closest friend, which would be a confidant, someone that I could confide in and they would never use it against me. And understanding that some people are just acquaintances and I call friend. Some people are closer friends and I would allow them in my home, or they would allow me in their home, or they would take me to their thing, or and then these levels of friendship, and that's how I learned to become safer with people that I could be safer with. And that was the last thing. And then back to what Paul said, see, submarine sailors, we're special forces and never really in the greater sense regarded as special forces. And when we would go on spec op, Paul, special operations, we were pre-expended. We were already disposed of, as if we were already expended, already gone. They would have denied we were there. They would have denied we were there. We were already pre-expended assets. And you talk about being vulnerable, and you can't, there's no one that really understands what that means unless you've lived it. The contracts I had to sign in order to have access and of if we had nuclear weapons, those and that many of us are still safeguarding those who are serving in those capacities after we are. And I have to really mitigate my language so as to not put them in a position where they might be at risk even today. I mean, stuff that and things won't be declassified ever. It might get revealed or discovered, but it will never be declassified. And only people with shared experience, something that went through, something you are going through or have gone through, they're in the authority position, and they give me permission to become familiar. And that has been the things that have helped me become safe, feel safe. There are some people that I'm just not going to tell my wife what some things were, not because I was bad at it. It's just that I'm not going to put that on her. And we many times protect those of people. I think I learned with my dad when he was dying, that those that are dying desperately want to talk to people about it, but they're afraid the people around them can't bear it. And the people around them desperately want to talk about it, but they're afraid that that's going to be too much to bear for the person who's such, at this particular juncture, and it might be the thing that pushes them over the edge. And the other thing I learned is that though my experiences are deeply, deeply personal, they are not incredibly unique. And that's the hard thing to believe. And I had a friend of mine said, Ron, you're so fearful of this. And if you're fearful, everybody else knows it. You just don't know they know it. And I'll end with that.
Well, there's a lot there. Thank you. Those are a lot of good analogies in there too. I appreciate that. The big thing that I heard from all that is discernment. And I think that is really important. It's learning to be discerning that not everybody is safe. And that's it. It's too bad. But again, that's how we can show up. And, you know, people watching this, that we can be those safe people that can really help others get their power back, you know, in healing, to be able to connect, you know, to thrive. It's so important. And yeah,
Yes. Sarah, also to that is, you said that we can be there, is I have learned through training about confidentiality, but I've grown beyond just a scope of practice, that if I'm in conversation with you about anything, your words are your property and they're not my property. And I do not have, and it's kind of this tenant landlord relationship, that you're the owner of it. And unless you give me a tenant relationship on how I might use that, how I might disclose that, you know, and if I treat your words and your thoughts as your property and their own, I can only use them if I'm a tenant and I have permissions and guidelines of what I can use and how I can use it. And that has given me great kind of an understanding of how to be that safe person for people who probably aren't that feeling that safe.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I think, well, it exudes, it's like sacred. It's a sacred arena that comes from love, care, empathy, right? You see what's going on. You see that this person really needs to feel protected and they need to get stuff out. I mean, that's, I appreciate that very much. Paul, welcome back. You've been very patient. Oh, and you are muted.
Thank you.
Oh,
I lost my internet connection and still don't have it back, so I'm on my phone now. But I wanted to just share 3 simple points. Number one is Jim has established his vulnerability completely. He came up and sat next to me, sat down in a theater in which Scott Mann's play was being played, and that took courage on his part because he didn't know who that ugly old guy was. And the fact is, I didn't recognize him either. So, but the next thing is that for all of you who have been dispatchers, part of the problem is the trauma that occurs during the calls, particularly ones that affect you in one way or another. But a bigger problem is that you never know the outcome of the call. And what that means is that you're stuck with this. You don't know if it turned out good or if the coroner had to be rolled out. And either way, it's a very difficult situation to be in. And the third thing is, Ron, we referred to that as plausible deniability. And I know exactly what you're talking about, and I'm not going to say any more than that, but that's exactly what that was. And it was intentional, and you knew going in that that was what you were accepting, and so you just did it. And fortunately, I'm still here. But anyway, I just thought I would share those simple thoughts for as a result of what I've heard from around the group here.
Hey, real quick, Paul, I'm glad that I was not sipping my coffee when you told your story about you and Jim becoming buddies there.
That's called nose coffee, Scott. That's called nose coffee. It comes right out your nose.
Well, that was a vulnerable time too, is, seeing Scott Mann's, like a lot of us were actually there. Yeah, yeah, Jim and Papa Rod, what are you guys doing?
This is so you all know I have an ink pen with me at all times because I don't want to die alone.
See, we learn a lot on these talks. Who would have known? Who would have known that we need to bring an ink pen? Well, listen, I'm going to shut off the recording. There's so many good things shared. And I think anybody who's struggling with vulnerability, who really is suffering in silence, you just have so many nuggets here to see the benefits of just being open, finding someone to just connect with. You're always welcome to come on here. As you can see, this is a very loving, mature, wise group. So I want to thank you all.